Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Good to see you, Daniel.
Good morning, Dr. Paul. How are you this morning?
Doing well. Another week to talk about foreign policy. Will there ever be a time when there won't be a big deal going on in foreign policy?
We'll talk about kittens then.
They've all declared themselves non-interventionists, and we're staying at home and minding our own business and making us healthy, wealthy, and wise. Well, no, I think it's going to be around for a while, the international things. And of course, the emphasis on international travel by a president is very important. Sometimes they do that to distract from problems at home. Sometimes they just do that because we're the policemen of the world.
Yes.
And if we don't go and engage, we're seen as weak. But if you go and engage and maybe dictate a little bit and tell people what we want, that gives us credibility. So Trump's been overseas for a week now, doing a lot of traveling, visiting a lot of people, and I guess my first reaction would be rather calmly. A lot of other fireworks should have happened. I would say there was more demagoguing and more distortion and more to talk about his way his trip was reported.
Yeah.
The media, rather than Trump messing up. So overall, I thought that they couldn't let that go by, so they had to create some problems. And I think in some ways they literally have. They've concocted problems. If there weren't any, they had to come up with something and blame Trump, for that. I guess you noticed the same thing.
Yeah, it's true. And he's, the main things are his meeting with Philippines President Duterte, which we'll talk about in a minute. The very brief meeting with President Putin of Russia, and they dared to exchange a couple of words. And probably generally speaking on China, his relation with China, they were hoping he'd be bombastic and like a bull in the China shop, so to speak. But in fact, that wasn't the case. So I think they were disappointed in that respect.
No, and there were so many things. And, the issue of human rights came up. Oh, Trump, he didn't fight for human rights. When you go to China, you tell them you don't treat people right. And that's the common theme. That fits into American exceptionalism. We treat people perfectly well. We become the moral order to tell other people how to take care of people and protect rights. But then when you look at it, maybe we have some infractions ourselves. I always considered the fact that unless our records are clean, we don't have much right to go about dictating to others, and just sort of the Christian idea of he who's without sin should cast the first stone. But it seems like we cast a lot of stones, and we do a lot of preaching. At the same time, we mess things up. But when I hear the word human rights, I always think liberalism, because I like the idea of civil liberties and protecting liberty. But human rights usually means, are you taking care of the people in an economic manner through socialism? And that's just my opinion, but that's the way I see it. But the people who have wondered about this, that human rights very, very important, but the one thing they don't talk about human rights or civil liberties or people themselves is collateral damage.
Yeah.
And violation of privacy and spying on other country and getting involved in other elections. This has to do with human rights too and liberty. But no, it's always the concentration that we directed toward. It's been common, even when we were in Washington, common to really go after China because they were the violators. And then I get to thinking of they are, but we have more. Our country is smaller than China. We have more prisoners than China because we have so many laws, and of course we're strict on drug laws too. So this is something that goes on. And then of course the media expected him to lecture Duterte, in the Philippines, but that didn't happen. Why didn't he bring up human rights? And even if he did, they might distort it. So I think that there was no doubt that where Trump remained silent, they made a big deal of it. If he didn't say something goofy, they didn't have much to go with. And they certainly were not going to put a positive spin on anything. And sometimes that leads to a little bit of confusion for me, because I might remember what Trump had said before and didn't like it. And then he goes out on the road And I said, well, he wasn't so bad. You know? But I think I have the greatest criticism for the media on the way they've handled this.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you talk about the human rights issue. The whole human rights issue is a smokescreen. It's total politics. It has nothing to do with the way foreign governments treat their people. If you are in favor, if you are in the favored position of Washington, they ignore all of your human rights violations. If they want you out, if they want your government out, they will pick apart every little tiny thing to go at. And we know, we talked about it before the show, there's no consistency because it's only a tool, it's a wedge to use against governments we don't like.
You know, to pick the worst government in the world for civil liberties, protection of civil liberties and human rights, it might be difficult. There's a few down at the bottom of the list on who are really terrible. But it has to be that one of our closest allies, and we participate with that country in destroying people's lives, has to be close to the bottom. And that is, of course, Saudi Arabia.
Sure.
But we were involved with the Saudis, you know, way back when the Afghan war was going, when the Soviets were in Afghanistan, to try to radicalize you know, the Saudis. And this continues. But here we are, we're military allies, and those pictures that we have shown and looked at and talked about of what's going on in Yemen, what about that? Doesn't that have something to do with human rights and human dignity? But no, the media never asks about that. They've never said, you know, why are we participating and look at what we have done? They might, you know, condemn it or something, but they will never tie it in to our foreign policy for participating in such violations.
No, that's just this total subjectivity, completely ignoring Yemen, completely into, I mean, we wouldn't have anything to say about internal Saudi policies, even if we personally found them repulsive, but certainly the U.S. ignores them. And in fact, when something does change, where they announce down the road somewhere women might be able to drive, the U.S. praises it. Oh, they're going in the right direction, you know. It's.
Well, you know, then there was a bit of a skirmish between Trump and with the media dealing with what Trump said about Putin.
Yeah.
You know, and that if you look at each word, it didn't offend me too much because he actually didn't try to aggravate things, and yet I didn't think he said anything too bad. And yet the media turned this up big time, you know, about what did Putin say, and he trusts Putin, but he won't trust his wonderful agency. You know, a few people in our security agencies literally lied before Congress, and they're supposed to be the people that we listen to. But the distortion of that has been going on for a long time, and actually took a long time to show that this report of the 17 agencies reporting what the Russians had done turned out not exactly true.
Yeah, and you know, of course, at the front of the line attacking this, I should back up a little bit. So apparently they had a couple of seconds to talk. Apparently, as soon as the press could talk to him, to Trump, saying, "Did you press him on whether they, you know, meddled in our election?" He said, "Every time I ask him, he says the same thing. It's getting embarrassing. You know, I tend to believe the guy." Something like this, something pretty basic. But of course, John McCain, Senator McCain, there's nothing America first about taking the word of a KGB colonel over that of the American intelligence community, you know, and it's this, but you know what's interesting, everything hinges on this January 6th intelligence assessment made not by 17, but as we know, by 3 agencies, CIA, NSA, and FBI, which is arguably not even an intelligence agency. And this is, everything rides on this, and it wasn't an NIE that we saw about Iraq and Iran, it was just an assessment, and we find out later, as Clapper said in congressional testimony, this was a group of hand-picked analysts. That's a quote-unquote word he used. And it's, in fact, Ray McGovern, our good friend of ours, who had a really good piece in Consortium News that we picked up, he pointed out you could put a group of anti-Russia analysts in a room for a week and they could come up with anything. You know, that's the whole point, that the process of the NIE, where you have dissenting views. They refused to allow the State Department Intelligence and the DIA to participate in this. Why is that? Well, State Department got it right on the Iraq NIE, remember? They said Iraq, you know, doesn't have weapons. We don't see any evidence that it does. And then the DIA is recently, well, in 2015, they said, you know, we have to bear some responsibility for our role in overthrowing the Ukrainian government. And so what do? They just shut them out. And this is the process. So we have to talk about the process of what this was.
But it's very simple. All we need is a special prosecutor to sort out all the facts. That is the part that just really bewilders me, because I think in many ways, or at least I'm hopeful, like a lot of Trump supporters would be, that he would clean up the mess and not be engaged in this thing and not go along with the status quo. But how did it happen where Mueller got to be the special prosecutor, where the record is so bad? I mean, I can't imagine anything decent and honest coming out of this, and yet he's still praised as the greatest person ever. Yet I think he fudges the truth on occasion, too.
Remember the Iraq War? He was heavily involved in pushing this thing based on lies.
Yeah, But you know, there's a lot of investigation that should go on, and Trump's always complaining about it, you know, on Hillary. Well, he's the president of the United States. Why doesn't he do something? But so I heard somebody the other day saying, well, we need a special prosecutor. But right now, that doesn't solve any problems. But if you can't get a special prosecutor that is going to look at it as a prosecutor, but this Mueller deal and what is happening there, it's strictly, you know, so you could say, you know, a party fight, but it really isn't.
Yeah.
Because there are some Republicans are as more opposed, or at least as opposed to Trump as the Democrats are. So it's probably an argument between the deep state and the establishment, and the only way you could react or analyze what Trump does is maybe he's overwhelmed with the potential harm done if he doesn't have to give in a little bit. And I keep thinking, well, that's maybe why he had to give in a little bit on the Russia approach. Yeah. So he gives in, but then when he meets him, he's a great guy, you know, and why don't you give him a break? We need to get along with Russia. And I'd like to think that's his real beliefs, but when you get these prosecutors in and the media pounding down on, the odds of getting us to the bottom of this is not very good. It's sort of like setting up commissions. I don't believe they ever reveal the truth. They just cover things up. I think these special prosecutors aren't much better.
Yeah, and even if he has the best of intentions, I don't think he realized how deep the swamp is. Even someone like Pompeo, he puts in as a CIA director, the guy's a complete neocon. He's a total, you know, in favor of all of the aggressive stance toward Russia. But, you know, we do have to continue going back, I think, to this January 6th assessment. I have a graphic up here, if we can get it up, that's really important. This is taken as the gospel, this January 6th assessment. But this is how they started it. Tell me if this gives you a lot of confidence, Dr. Paul. This is what the intelligence community itself said. Judgments are not intended to apply that we have proof that shows something to be fact. Assessments are based on collected information, which is often incomplete or fragmentary, as well as logic, argumentation, and precedents. This is how they preface this report that is proof positive.
Yeah, but the whole thing is, if they'd have read that, somebody wouldn't have been harping on this, that it's proof positive. So the media just chimes in, and it goes on, and it gets so politicized. You know, since it's difficult to sort all this out, of course, our solution is to stay out of the mess, stay out of the quagmire, and that is, of course, a different foreign policy where these problems wouldn't exist. But as long as we're involved, you know, like if they do some investigating or getting involved in our elections, have we ever done that to anybody else? So that's really where the problem is we're so deeply involved, everybody's deeply involved, and then it becomes a political football back and forth and blame game, and yet the real players are pretty invisible. You know, who's really trying to get rid of Trump? And obviously, the information looks pretty good that is the goal of a lot of people in high places right now. And of course, it wouldn't be Trump supporters. That's one half or more of the Republican Party. And Democrats certainly, for partisan reasons, would not want to. But who brings it all together? Why do very many high-ranking Republicans, and you know, special senators too, you know, like Graham and McCain, you know, they're orchestrating for the overthrow. You know, that's where their position would be, and of course they support all this neocon foreign policy. So it's not an easy thing to dissect, but I think the real message that I thought was important to get out was that Trump was not at his best, but possibly at his best on this trip.
Yeah.
He certainly wasn't out there, causing a lot more harm for America or even for himself. But he comes back, and what does he get hit? And the media would probably say, well, that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to analyze. But are we supposed to lie about it?
Yeah.
Just like that statement you put up there. It's not, they're not true, but they keep it going on. And just think how long this, Russian thing has been going on with zero proof. And then you get a guy like Mueller who's going to sort it out. Wow.
We could talk about some of the positive things. I think the China aspect was very good. He had a long meeting with Xi. I think it was a 2-hour meeting with Xi. He came out and he actually was a little bit more nuanced in his view. And so the press didn't say, well, that's much better that he's not bashing it. They said, well, that's not what he said a few weeks ago. But and I think, I'm going to ask because I'm curious how you think about this. I think he essentially got some of the problems right. He said, hey, just don't blame China for this problem. It's our fault it's previous administration's fault for allowing this trade deficit to take place and to grow. So he gets that part. The diagnosis is right.
Yeah, and the media certainly would agree with that. To be unhappy about that, they don't want to blame the previous administration. But that reminds me of something I say about economics, because Trump has now so far witnessed a very good stock market, not true economic growth, but he takes all the credit, for the stock market growth. Next month, if the stock market crashes, hands off. And I've often said that, Obama, when he took office, there was in 2008, there was a terrible time for economic. That wasn't Obama's fault.
Yeah.
It's Obama's fault, now on foreign policy of the things that he has done. Assad has to go and all these other things, Libya, and all part of these problems that he helped create. But it's best to try to dissect this out. You can't blame the previous president for everything, but that's a handy tool if it fits, who's vying for power. And if they can use it and demagogue it, they surely will. So no, I think Trump had the right diagnosis on that. It was the previous administration, but it's the previous administration economic or foreign policy that generally is the case because they just happen to follow a policy of economic intervention and foreign policy intervention, and that's what they should address.
Yeah, unfortunately it goes back to the lack of principles. There was a lighthearted moment when he tweeted out that he seemed a little unhappy that Kim Jong-un referred to him as old. He said, I never called you short and fat. So it was still classic Trump, and now that Twitter allows you to have 240 characters, he's able to do double barrels. But I would just in closing say, everyone is, why are you so focused on the Russia thing? They would say, oh, because you go on RT, this and that. It's because this is the single most important issue right now. If this does not get resolved, we are heading toward a nuclear confrontation. That's why I think we harp on it so much. It is so important because if the whole thing is based on a house on sand, which is what we suspect, having seen no evidence, then we are headed down a road that could lead to our own oblivion, Dr. Paul. So that's why I think we're so focused on it.
Yes, and there's always going to be another issue come up today. It's Russia, but Russia, the United States is involved around the world. And I guess it could be tomorrow, the next day, we're going to be talking about Yemen again and Saudi Arabia and what's happening there. There's a lot of very dangerous things there, but it's all a reflection of unnecessarily getting involved in events around the world that we don't need to be involved with, causes more harm than it helps. And until we as a people wake up and say, the founders were right, we should mind our own business, stay at home, don't get involved in the internal affairs of other nations, that would be a much better way to go if your goal is to seek peace and prosperity. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.